Hi folks, this is David Birchall and this is the second of two lecture pods for week 4 of When Worlds Collide for spring 2020. It makes sense to listen to the other lecture pod first. If you haven't, that you should. It's on the Moogles. This one is covering the second part of the topic you can see there on the screen there, the spread of British authority. First English, then British authority throughout India in the 18th century. And that bloke on the right-hand side of the screen is William Fielding. I'll come back to him a little bit later, wearing a splendid outfit, half English, half Indian, or so he imagines, with his Indian servant boy showing him the way. First of all, we need to talk about this thing called the East India Company, which will come up over the next several weeks. And I'll sort of, at the end of this lecture pod, I'll segue us to next week's topic as well. The East India Company was the grandest of all the chartered trading companies of the early modern world and became effectively a state in its own right. As you'll recall from last week's topic, when England secured trading colonies around the world in the 17th century, they governed them in different ways. Sometimes there were settlers in the North American colonies who self-governed, the white settler colonies there. At other times, however, the British used companies like the Virginia Company in colonial America, the South Seas Company, and most famously the East India Company to, in effect, run colonies for them, a sort of public-private partnership, as we call them today. These companies were, in fact, private companies. They were built on the joint stock model. People took out shares and very often did very well. Sometimes not so well. The South Seas Company went under, taking a lot of fortunes with it. The East India Company didn't go under, at least through most of the period we're talking about, but it had an up and down fortune as well. So private investors bought stock, and the Crown stayed out of it financially. In theory, that was the best thing for both parties. But it did, of course, mean that while the Crown was keeping itself at arm's distance from British expansion, the East India Company, to a significant extent, was free to do its own thing, even when it was something the British Crown would not itself have done. Third dot point there. English and later British activity abroad then gets a strikingly financially focused or mercantile character. The objective of the East India Company is to make money for its investors. It's not about building political colonies. It's not about creating new institutions. It's about preserving as much as possible the way things are and changing them only so far as is necessary to benefit the affairs of the company. As I said in the third dot point there, even war making was outsourced in the world of these great trading companies. That goes back to the 16th century. In fact, if you think of the sort of famous British seafarers of the 16th century like Sir Francis Drake or Sir Walter Raleigh, they were actually involved in public-private partnerships of their own. They were part discoverers and part pirates who worked at arm's length from the British Crown while they stole Spanish gold. So by 1800, the East India Company is by far the most successful of those famous joint stock trading companies, involved in perhaps as much as half of the world's trade, despite the narrow title. And so famous and important that it simply became known as the company. If you said the company in British governing circles, people would know what you meant. So as I said already, the East India Company at its peak, I should mention a couple of images there. That's its headquarters in India, bottom right hand corner, and top right hand corner you can see on the ceiling in a very 17th century way an allegorical image of the mystical East bringing its riches to Britannia there. Isn't that very nice of them? So the East India Company at its peak was a kind of parallel government to English and British authority abroad. There was a board of directors in London which directed the activities of the company abroad, or at least it attempted to. It wasn't absolutely sure what was going on at times. It issued orders to a governor in Bengal who was not directly responsible to the Parliament in London, which is a very strange arrangement, we might think. So the company possessed its own army and a kind of navy and a kind of mercantile navy as well, of ships moving goods around the world. And in India it developed its own civil service, what became known as the Indian Civil Service, that over time became de facto, in fact, if not in law, the civil service of British India, and which created a government bureaucracy designed to rule large parts of India through human personnel numbering as few as a few thousand British people. So over time, of course, Indians had to be hired into the civil service as well. From its base in Bengal, gradually the company extended its influence across much of India by a combination of commerce, loans, trade, bribery, corruption, I should probably put in there well, and warfare, a kind of financial military complex. From the time of the victories of the notorious British General Robert Clive in the 1750s, the East India Company had become, in effect, the government of a good part of Mughal India, ruling in the emperor's name, but really in the interests of the company. You may come across in this week's topic this term, nabobs, and you might wonder what it means. Well, here are. There's a few images on the right side there that I'll explain in a second. India was the great get-rich-quick scheme of 18th century Britain. Young men who were not always academically gifted or even bright and didn't have a sterling career in front of them in Britain could instead move to India and make a lot of cash fast, move up the social scale and live like lords. And then they could come back to England and try and keep up the same lifestyle. So top right hand corner there you have an image of Britons returned from service with the East India Company, returned to England with a repast in front of them there on the table, which is a combination again of English stuff and Indian stuff. And you can see, of course, there's a huge pot of Indian tea. English literature in the 18th and early 19th centuries, if you know it, is full of characters out of this playbook of nabobs and the like. Sometimes they're presented seriously. More commonly, they're presented as figures of fun or even disgust. Other Britons were often keenly aware that if you went to India and came back suddenly rich, you hadn't usually made your money by the sweat of your own brow. You'd been extorting Indian people. And also, of course, you'd leapt up the social scale above people who thought they were your social betters, which was even worse. There are famous characters in 18th, 19th century British fiction. Jos Sedley in William Thackeray's famous Vanity Fair, arguably the greatest British novel of the 19th century, is a nabob and presented as this ridiculous figure who's come back to England, this big man in all senses of that word, who suddenly thinks he's a lord and lives like one. While in India, nabobs wore combinations of British and Indian dress, like William Fielding in the picture I showed you before, and when they returned to England, they often had new and exotic tastes. They liked to keep eating Indian food. Often they had acquired a taste for curries. They liked to drink tea, and they liked to impress people with their newfound wealth. They liked even to pretend that they were Indian lords themselves. This is in England. I hope it wasn't winter when those two guys were standing there. We forget this now, but tea became the national drink of Britain. Up until the period of the nabobs and the East India Company, the British were actually coffee drinkers, in fact. Well, in Scotland they were Scotch drinkers, but in England they were coffee drinkers. And coffee houses had been important social gathering places of early 18th century England, but by the late 18th century, England has switched to tea, which is the new fashionable drink. So the nabobs, for better or for worse, came to define the British influence in India. The Indians, to be honest, often saw the worst of the British. They saw the get-rich-quick scheme folks. They saw folks who liked to lord it over other people. They saw folks who were not that interested in social niceties and who enjoyed treating Indian people like dirt. But there was a kind of feedback effect, because these folks also brought back to Britain, as I've said, an interest, however partial it was, in Indian culture, Indian decorations, Indian habits of life, and as I say, tea, curry, various other things, became part of the British lifestyle, which also then became kind of more cosmopolitan as well. Britain started to look a little more like a sort of global country at this time. Famous example, bottom right hand corner, That's not in India. That's on the south coast in England, in the holiday town of Brighton, which in the 18th century was a very racy place. People went to have dirty weekends. Look that up, by the way. That is Brighton Palace, which was built for George IV as a sort of holiday destination of his on the south coast of England. And it looks out in the general direction of the English Channel, believe it or not. After the Battle of Buxar in 1764, the last of the significant emperors, Shah Alam, signed a treaty with the British at Allahabad that gave the East India Company effective rule of Bengal, while the treaty purported to keep him in control and involved the British paying him tribute every year, as if he was still the Lord. So the British put on a play performance that the Mughal emperor was still in charge, while really they ran things behind the scenes. That was not the first time or the last time in history that governing, conquering powers had behaved that way. Sinister example from the early 20th century, it was the way the Nazis ruled occupied Europe as well, that they killed an awful lot more people than the British, I have to say. And this device became the hallmark of British rule in India, to rule indirectly, pretending to still have the Mughals in control. And the British, first in the form of the East India Company and then the British government, maintained this fiction up to the middle of the 19th century. It's why British rule in India is called the Raj. It's why Queen Victoria styled herself the Empress, or was styled the Empress of India, as if she was somehow the heir to the Mughal dynasty. However, as Ray points out, it wasn't simply clever, wily generals like Robert Clive or wily British diplomats outsmarting the Mughal emperor. The Mughal Empire was already falling over from within. In a sense, the British had kind of corrupted it. At least that was the Mughal point of view. The East India Company had both borrowed and lent money over a long period of time and created economic relationships of dependence. They were turning the Mughal elite into financially savvy but also financially indebted people, and a new commercial class sprang up in Mughal India, which was often far wealthier and more culturally sophisticated than the traditional ruling elite, thus undermining the authority of the traditional ruling elite. If you wanted a playbook as to how to destroy a traditional culture, if that was your game, this is one way you would follow the playbook, to undermine the traditional order by throwing money around and creating a new commercial class who can rise up over the heads of the old aristocracy. So this is the cause of the despair described by Ray in the other reading up on Views for this week. Throughout the 18th century, the company was a skillful political and financial actor in India. It extended its authority, but it did so indirectly. It always tried to work behind the Mughal emperors and their hirelings rather than in front of them. The British tried to make themselves unobtrusive as far as they could, given the young nabobs' efforts to make spectacles of themselves. And they set, in the traditional Mughal fashion, one prince against another and one principality and another. They basically adopted the old Mughal pattern of divide and conquer. However, jumping dot points there. However, in the 1780s, and this leads us into next week's topic, in the 1780s, while Bengal was under the authority of Governor Warren Hastings, that's Warren Hastings on the bottom right hand there, looking pensive. Must have been the first time in his life he ever did that. An alliance of local princes put company rule under threat, and the stockholders of the East India Company panicked and started to sell their shares. Well, this had happened to the South Seas Company before, and because of the volatile nature of the investments, if that's what they were, that these trading companies had, they were always in risk of having a kind of economic bubble. In fact, the South Seas Company experienced what was called a South Seas bubble, kind of like the tech wreck of the 1980s or the tulip crisis of Holland in the 17th century, where it was suddenly realised that the South Seas Company did not have the capacity to support itself. The East India Company had much better assets than the South Seas Company, but they were still in a lot of trouble. And so Hastings had no alternatives but to turn to London to look for a financial bailout to rescue the East India Company from its troubles. But here he created a problem. Up until this point, the British Parliament had mostly ignored the East India Company as much as it could. He couldn't ignore them coming to them cap in hand asking for money. And a young fellow called Edmund Burke rose out of Parliament determined to make Warren Hastings and the company's life as miserable as possible. And that'll take us to next week's topic. See you then. Take care.